Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I am Professor Maureen Flanagan. I am the chair of the Humanities Department here at IIT. And we're very pleased that we're able to have this program to welcome Professor Kuznick and the director, Oliver Stone, who will be here in a little while. But before we get started, we're going to do a few introductions, and I would like to introduce Dean Russell Betts, who is the Dean of the College of Science and Letters.
Thank you, Maureen. We're fortunate today to have Oliver Stone. At least he'll be here later. I gather he's suffering from the flu and is resting in the hotel for a while, and Professor Peter Kuznick, and to show and discuss a series of documentaries they've put on cable television entitled The Untold History of the United States. Of course, Oliver Stone is an iconic filmmaker, and I'm sure everybody in this room has seen one or more of his films, famous ones, JFK, Platoon, Scarface, and the list goes on. He's a longtime collaborator with Professor Kuznick, who is a professor at American University and is director of the Nuclear Studies Institute, which focuses on the history of nuclear weapons and the Cold War and so on. Just looking on the web, I saw he was quite involved when the Enola Gay was put up on exhibition in the Smithsonian out by Dulles Airport. Last summer, I had the pleasure of going to that museum and seeing the Enola Gay with John Anderson was there too. It was an alumni event, a great occasion, and to be able to see that piece of history is just amazing, to look up and see the glass window on the front of the plane that the bomb aimer must have looked down through as the bomb was released on Hiroshima. Of course, Professor Kuznick had pointed out that this display contained none of the other aspects of nuclear weapons and the terrible things that came with them. You probably heard me say many times how important I think it is, particularly at a place like IIT, that our scientists and technologists also study the humanities and social sciences and learn how the world really works. And actually, when you think about it, the story of the development and use of nuclear weapons is an incredible mixture of science and technology and history and politics and ethics and cultural differences and prejudices. And I think we're going to see some of that today. Something we also forget often is that science is really not a whole lot different than anything else human beings do. It's done by humans, and with their normal good points and sometimes bad points. And anybody who's read or studied the history of the Manhattan Project sees the conflicts between the characters in that drama, Oppenheimer and Teller and Groves, and how that eventually led to the political downfall of Oppenheimer, caused in large part by Teller himself. The one thing that makes science a little bit different is we claim to be able to find the truth by requiring that what we do is repeatable. I do an experiment, I get a result. I write down what I do, you go and do it, and you get the same result. So we think we've arrived at some truth. In history, one doesn't have that luxury. You can't run history again, although the famous quote is, "Those who do not learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat them." But what happens in history is one can arrive at truth with a critical examination by many people from many different points of view of the same set of facts. And in that way, one might imagine there's some consistent and honest picture of what really happened. And I think this is part of what this series attempts to do. I should add, by the way, that this inability to repeat things is also true in some important areas of science. Cosmology, we have one universe. But also things like climate change, global warming. That's a one-shot deal. And so maybe we have something to learn from the historians. I'll just welcome you all here and pass it back to Maureen, who's going to explain how the day will go. And, well, thank you.
What we're going to do is I will be introducing Professor Kuznick. He's going to say a few words of introduction about what you're going to see, and then after the documentary piece is finished, we will open the floor to discussion, questions, by which time Oliver Stone will be here also. So he'll be here to talk to you about what he's done and what it is that he thinks is important in the sense of why he's made this documentary, why he and Professor Kuznick have made this documentary. Because I'm a U.S. historian, I'm doubly pleased that we could bring this to IIT. And just to follow up a tiny bit on what Dean Betts has said, history is messy. And history is messy because it's made by people, and people are messy. And so something such as an episode dedicated to thinking about the development and use of the atomic bomb in World War II is likely to be, quite often is, very controversial. People have different opinions. People feel strongly about these things. And as a historian, I think that's good. I think that we should debate these things, that we should not have one set view of how things are, that we should not strive for consensus. We should strive for discussion, for dialogue, in an attempt to sort out the various things that we know, that we don't know, that other people know that can contribute to the conversation. So, without going any further, I would like to introduce Professor Peter Kuznick, who is as Russell said, the director of the Nuclear Studies program at American University, and he is a professor of U.S. history. Peter?
Thanks, Maureen, Russell. Thank you all for coming out on this cold day. What I want to do is give you a little bit of background, because what you're going to be seeing is episode 3 of the Untold History of the United States that was just shown on Showtime. It's a 10-part documentary film series that goes along with our book. But if you just tune into episode 3 without knowing what's in 1 and 2, you're going to miss a little bit. So I want to fill you in about what we said in 1 and 2. The book starts really in the late 19th century, and is tracing the roots of American empire and the national security state. The documentaries begin with World War II, although we've added 2 more to the box set that we're going to be putting out that go back to the 1890s, but on television we began with World War II. And the first myth that we were debunking in our chapter on World War II is the idea that the United States was responsible for the victory in Europe during World War II. What most Americans don't realize was that while the United States and the British were confronting 10 German divisions combined, the Russians were confronting 200. And that's the case until June of 1944. Most Americans don't realize that we lost about 305,000 people in combat. The Soviets lost 27 million people in total during World War II. So a lot of things that get lost in the kind of American exceptionalist telling of the history that we think is important to understand, because we go from there in Chapter 2 to talking about the roots of the Cold War and how that develops as part of World War II. And among the things we point out there is while the Germans were attacking Russia and the Russians were asking for help, Roosevelt, in June of 1942, asked Stalin to send Molotov to the United States to meet with Roosevelt. And Roosevelt and Molotov and General Marshall issued a statement in June of 1942 saying that the United States was pledged to open up a second front in Europe before the end of 1942, so that to take the pressure off the Russians. Well, as you all know, that second front doesn't open until June of 1944. So there are a lot of things that go on that create the mistrust between the United States and the Soviet Union even during the war. And that's what we deal with in the first 2 episodes. But we also introduce one very important character or actor who you're going to see in this episode without the background. So let me give you a little bit on that. Let me ask you, who was Roosevelt's vice president from 1941 to 1945? Yeah, but you know that, but most people don't know. I mean, Ari and Loretta were not supposed to be the ones to answer. Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace is a figure who's been largely lost to history, although he's what we consider him an absolutely remarkable human being. People who have extremely conservative views tend to look at him as a bad guy in history. But for Oliver and I, Henry Wallace was a visionary. He was Secretary of Agriculture during the first two New Deal administrations. And then Roosevelt insisted on having it on the ticket in 1940 because he knew we were on the verge of fighting a war against fascism, and he wanted a real progressive anti-fascist on the ticket as vice president. So Wallace, finally, they get him on the ticket, and he's extraordinary as vice president. In 1941, Henry Luce, the head of the Time Life empire, says that the 20th century must be the American century. The United States should dominate the world politically, economically, militarily, culturally. Henry Wallace countered that as vice president, and he said the 20th century must be the century of the common man. And he called for a worldwide people's revolution to end imperialism and colonialism, end economic exploitation, end monopolies and cartels, for global full employment, for spreading the fruits of science and technology throughout the third world. He was proposing he said that what we need is a worldwide people's revolution in the tradition of the American Revolution, French Revolution, Latin American revolutions, and the Russian Revolution. He said that America's fascists are those people who think Wall Street comes first and the country comes second. He was very, very progressive, very radical in his views. And there were a lot of people who hated him. The British and the French hated him and wanted him off the ticket because of his anti-colonialism. The business people wanted him off the ticket because of support for unions and labor rights. The Wall Street people wanted him off the ticket because of his condemnation of Wall Street. The Southern segregationists wanted him off the ticket because he was a leading supporter of African-American civil rights. And the anti-feminists wanted him off the ticket because he's the leading supporter of women's rights long beforehand. So he had enemies, and they decided what they called Pauley's coup. Edwin Pauley was the treasurer of the Democratic Party. He said he entered politics when he realized it was cheaper to elect a new Congress than to buy up the old one. And he becomes the treasurer of the Democratic Party, and he stages what he calls a coup, and he surrounds Roosevelt with all these conservatives who say they hate Wallace, and Wallace should be off the ticket. So even though there's this campaign to get Wallace off the ticket, what they realized, the party bosses, was that that Roosevelt was getting ill, was not going to survive another term, that whoever became vice president in 1944 would become the next president of the United States, so they wanted to replace Wallace. And who do they choose? Harry Truman, but that's a different part of the story. But what happens is, on the night of the Democratic Party convention, the night it began, July 20th, 1944, Gallup did a survey asking potential voters who they wanted on the ticket as vice president. 65% said they wanted Wallace as vice president. 2% said they wanted Harry Truman. When the convention began that night, Wallace made the seconding speech for Roosevelt. The place went wild in a spontaneous demonstration led by Adlai Stevenson and Hubert Humphrey. And in the midst of this 45-minute demonstration, Claude Pepper, senator from Florida, realized if he could get to the microphone and get Wallace's name and nomination that night, that they would defy the party bosses and Wallace would be back on the ticket as vice president. When Pepper started fighting his way through the crowd, the party bosses saw what was happening. They started screaming for Sam Jackson, who was chairing the session, to adjourn it. They said, it's a fire hazard, adjourn it now. Jackson says, I have a motion to adjourn. All in favor say aye. About 5% of the people said aye. All opposed say nay. Everybody says nay. Claude Pepper was 5 feet from the microphone, and Jackson adjourned the session. Had Pepper gotten 5 more feet to the microphone, got Wallace's name and back in nomination, Wallace would have become president on April 12, 1945, when Roosevelt died. And we argue there would have been certainly no atomic bombing in 1945 had Wallace been on the ticket and president, and there very likely would have been no Cold War. All of American history and all of world history would have been very, very different. What a world it could have been had there not been a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, not been two superpowers threatening each other with annihilation and everything else that happened as a result of that. So that's the background that you need to know to make sense out of the episode you're going to see. You're going to see episode 3 is really about the decision to drop the bomb, the consequence of that decision, the reasons why Oliver and I think it was not only militarily unnecessary, but morally repugnant. So you're going to see our controversial interpretation, and we'd be happy to discuss it with you afterwards. Thank you.
No, please sit down. First of all, I'd like to say, above all, thank you so much for writing that book, and thank you so much for making this documentary film series that millions and millions of Americans are seeing, because I think we cannot be anything unless we know our history. And unfortunately, we don't know our history all that well, and I think the visual impact is very powerful. I'd like to thank Dean Ellen Mitchell, who's the Dean of the new college that is in formation, the College of Lewis College of Human Sciences, and I'd like to thank Dean Russell Bett of the College of Science and Letters, who are instrumental in putting this program together, and I'd like to thank President John Anderson as well. It is really a great honor and privilege for me to introduce both Oliver Stone and Peter Kuznick, and I think I know one says this, but it's certainly true. He is certainly a man who does need very little introduction, and since you probably don't want to hear all that much from me, I will be very brief. He has won Academy Awards for directing Born on the 4th of July, Platoon, and for writing Midnight Express. He's also received 3 Golden Globes for directing Platoon, Born on the 4th of July, and 1 for writing Midnight Express. And the 2 of them combined produced and wrote and developed this series. Peter Kuznick, who's already been introduced several times, I'm just going to be even briefer with him. In addition to running the Institute for Nuclear Studies at American University. Do I have it right, Peter?
Close enough.
Close enough,
nuclear
okay.
Studies.
Oh, nuclear studies, okay. I want to say he also, since 1995, has been taking students over to visit Kyoto, Nagasaki, and Hiroshima, and to meeting with Japanese people as well, and other people from throughout Asia. And that is an open program. If any student from here is interested, you are also encouraged to participate as well. He's the author of Beyond the Laboratory, Scientists as Political Activists in 1930s Americas, and 2 other books as well, one of which was published in Japanese as well. I want to remind everybody that after this program, there will be a book signing, and books are going to be on sale. They will be available to sign the books, and it will be held in the Welcome Center which is right next to the Pritzker Club. So at this point, I'm going to turn the program over to you, and I don't know if either or both of you would like to say a few words or open it up directly to questions, comments.
Well, actually, since everybody's seen the documentary, why don't we just open it up to the audience and let them ask us or challenge us or develop these ideas more?
What was the question?
The question was, well, I'll answer it and then you'll figure out what the question was. The collaboration, we bring different skills to this. What Oliver was able to do, I would do the first drafts, and then Oliver would give me feedback. I'd do a second draft, then we go back and forth writing drafts, and lots of drafts of each of these episodes. But what Oliver is able to do, as you saw, is bring to life, in a way, I think that each of these chapters, 10 chapters, is as compelling as a feature film. I mean, I find them riveting. Nobody's ever said anything is boring. You said that they're dense. Well, I'd never written a documentary before, and I had more than twice as much information in my first drafts. And Oliver and the people there would come back to me and say, nobody's going to follow any of this. We've got to slow it down. And so that's part of why we did the book with it, to give a lot more information and background and evidence and our sources. But the collaboration really brought together our diverse skills. My skills as a historian, my graduate students. One of my graduate students, Ari Sirota, is here, who helped with the research, but a lot of graduate students. And Oliver and his people, while they were involved in the writing process also, and some of the research, got the visuals. A lot of these visuals are things nobody's ever seen before, and brought it to life in that way, dramatic way that he could do as a great filmmaker.
Yes, I very much like your school here. I came to your school the first time here a few minutes ago, and I was wandering around these corridors. I got lost in this labyrinth that you've created, and it's visual lines. You know, it's a deceiving school. It looks very work-oriented on the surface, technically proficient. You come in, and you find that there is an artistic maze going on here. It's a bit like The Shining. And I think it's very clever use of space, and I became aware of it as I was walking the corridors, so to speak. And the same thing is true of history. I am not a historian. I've lived these years of this documentary from 1946 on. I always ignored the atomic bomb. I took it for granted power that we had. And these questions come to haunt you in the later part of your life, perhaps, some of you. And I met Peter in the 1990s, and he had invited me to a film class that he'd been teaching on my films. And we really started to talk about the atomic bomb, and it brought me home, back to my beginnings. It brought me back to New York, center of the world, megalopolis, egomania, the power of the world, the right we had to go to Vietnam, the rights we had to intervene in other countries. It was a given, and it was apparent. And many of us of our generation enacted those dreams, whether we were businessmen working for banks and neoliberal sources and resources, or monetary funds that were exploiting these countries, or as soldiers who went over there to fight and to take, and to, as General Smedley Butler said in an earlier chapter, you know, it's a big business, it's a racket, bigger than Al Capone ever dreamed. He only ran 3 counties. As a Marine general, I went to 25 countries to enforce the standards of Standard Oil and big business and Brown Harriman Brothers, et cetera, United Fruit, all those interventions. This is what's still going on a much larger scale now. And now we're in space. So this is a horror story too, by the way. It's not American history as we learned it in school when we were bored stiff because we always knew we were the good guys. This is a much more ambiguous thriller, like your maze in your building here. Life is ambiguous and complicated and sometimes very dangerous. So I brought to this my style and my thinking, and not ideology. He comes from the left, I came from the right. We met. I went further to the left than he went to the right, but we met. And I think it's shocking to me, the Henry Wallace, everything, the atomic bomb. The more you find out, the less assured you can be about your place in this empire. And you as a younger generation are facing that. And I also want to say in behalf of the style that we did it in a style that I think is fresh for a documentary, because we brought feature film techniques, we brought the love of feature films, we put clips in, whether they were anti or pro, they were great clips at that moment. I mean, Curtis LeMay has never looked better than when Gregory Peck interprets it, because if you ever met the real Curtis LeMay, you'd be terrified. He was a powerful man, though, no question. So here we go. I mean, the music and of course you have to, I hope you recognize where the facts are, and sometimes we go into suggestions, opinions, and editorialization. We frankly do, and we have the right to do it because it's our movie. And, the critics can say what they want, but they're not going to agree with this interpretation because most of those critics are invested in this country. They are working for magazines and media that have a huge financial investment in making this system right, making it work, calling it the best in the world, American exceptionalism. It goes on and on. We have a bipartisan foreign policy. 2 candidates represented it. American empire, American power around the world. We have now become a global policeman without ever voting on it. We just gradually stumbled into this role, the British like to say. But the British gave it to us in 1944, I think. They handed it to us in Greece. So here we are.
Well, we voted on it. We have voted on it. In 1972, American people had a real choice. between Richard Nixon and George McGovern, and they chose Nixon. and I chose McGovern, but they didn't agree with me.
Well, we were in the middle of a war, though, and there was pressure.
But the people were voting for war in that sense, and Nixon always tried to say he was
they voted for Bush in
second time,
2004.
2004.
That was, to the rest of the world, that was a shock.
Yeah.
He wasn't elected the first time, but he did get in the second time. Oh, some people even doubt that. Go ahead.
So in the documentary, you were talking about Truman and how, he kept playing up the importance of the atomic bomb and how, he kept saying that we could save more and more lives. And a lot of the, members of the cabinets had the same viewpoint, while others had the counterpoint that it wasn't that important. But over time, Truman and people of the same opinion, their story sort of prevailed, as opposed to the other members. Was it because the other people just weren't vocal? I mean, I guess my question is, why did the Truman story prevail, and the other people's story just kind of, what you say is the truth, just kind of got covered up?
Well, it's a little more complicated. When 85% of the American people, when they were polled after the atomic bombing, said they supported the atomic bombing, 22.7, almost 23% of the American people, when polled, said that they wished that the Japanese had not surrendered so quickly so we would have more of a chance to drop more bombs on them. 23% of the Americans wish we could have dropped more atomic bombs on the Japanese. So you have to put it partly in the context of the time. The Japanese, as we say, were the most hated foe we've ever faced. So in that sense, and the American people were told, especially the soldiers, that dropping the atomic bomb saved their lives. So people were very invested in that from the very beginning. But when in August of 1946, 1 year later, John Hersey's articles on Hiroshima came out, and later the book Hiroshima. And that for the first time, if those of you who haven't read it really should, because it traces 6 survivors of the atomic bombing in Hiroshima. And for the first time, it humanizes the victims in Hiroshima. And we went through a national purging of a sort there, and when people started to question it very, very severely. So at that point, James Conan from Harvard told Henry Stimson to write an article giving the official interpretation defending the bomb. And that comes out in early 47. But that's the point when this idea becomes really crystallized in the public mind, that the bomb was dropped in order to prevent an invasion, and then Truman starts raising the numbers, then it says 500,000 Americans would have died in the invasion, so therefore the bomb becomes justifiable, legitimate, and necessary. In that way. We've been fighting against it. And during Vietnam period, this became a left-right issue. And it wasn't always a left-right issue. It wasn't only just people on the left, the liberals and radicals, criticizing the bomb decision. Initially, the conservatives held that view as well. In fact, in William Buckley's magazine, National Review, in 1959, there was an article by Medford Evans, which he says, the opposition to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki has become part of the national conservative credo. So initially, it wasn't even conservatives held that view. The Vatican came out denouncing it. Christian Century came out denouncing it. John Foster Dulles, of all people, denounced it initially as immoral and unnecessary. But then later, it's changed. So now it's become an effort that we've got to give people some of that information again, because people have forgotten this. I mean, some of you might have studied this and know it, but most Americans don't.
That's why particularly we've been identified as 1950s Stalinists. You see, it's bizarre because we're really dealing with 80 years of history. I mean, actually 120 years of history. So it's significant, a story of the American Empire. But this 1940s, 50s issue is still alive because a lot of these people are older people. They're out there defending the ramparts again.
But even when we've had a chance, even with World War II veterans, I've spoken to a lot of groups of World War II veterans, and if I can have an hour with them to talk about what we're saying, because they think we're saying before we start, they think Truman's a hero, he saved their lives, and they think we're saying they should have invaded and gotten killed. And we're saying just the opposite, that the veterans and their contribution has been demeaned and diminished by the idea that it was the bomb that won the war. The bomb wasn't what won the war. The Soviet invasion was the thing that finished off the Japanese, but it was the fighting of the American soldiers that had won the war.
So the point is made that, in part, this was a demonstration of power that had to be made, and certainly with one uranium bomb and one plutonium bomb, that probably lends itself to thinking that way. If they had not been dropped,
Yeah.
do you think they would ever have been dropped, and if so, where?
We don't know. There's no way to know, but what Wallace and Oppenheimer and most of the other physicists wanted to do is very different than the chemists after World War I. The chemists who were involved in chemical warfare research lobbied against any kind of ban on future use of chemical warfare. They wanted chemical weapons to be used, poison gas to be used in future wars. The physicists, as you would know, reacted just the opposite than that. The physicists led the campaign to ban use of nuclear weapons ever again. They wanted international authorities to take this over, and they didn't want any country to have nuclear weapons, including the United States. The Acheson-Lilienthal plan gave us a chance to do that. Oppenheimer drafted it. Dean Acheson, who's certainly a realist and not soft-headed at all, said this was a brilliant plan and it could work for abolishing nuclear weapons. So maybe it was possible. That's why we think if Wallace had been in there, it would have been possible to prevent this from happening. But the danger is, once that knowledge is out there, you can't get that genie back in that bottle. And so this is a risk that we're going to have. But we're doing the same thing now with drones. Okay, we're using drones, and that's good because we're the good guys, right? So we can get those bad Al-Qaeda people. But that technology is not that sophisticated. 50 other countries now have either bought or developed their own drone technologies. The leaders in that are countries like Iran and China. What if Iran or China starts using drones like we use drones? I mean, once we start these things, then it becomes more dangerous and other countries get them. You know, Iran maybe wants them. North Korea has nuclear weapons. 9 countries have nuclear weapons now. And we saw the process. You know, we start with the 1 or 2 bombs, but I take my students to Hiroshima and Nagasaki every year, and your students should join us because it's open to everybody. And there was one plaque in the Atomic Bomb Museum in Hiroshima that I kept copying down every year to make sure I remembered it. And it said that by the mid-1980s, the world had developed the equivalent of 1.47 million Hiroshima bombs. What kind of insane species are we? 1.47 million Hiroshima bombs. How many times over do we have to be able to wipe out everybody on the planet before we're satisfied? And that's the madness that we're trying to document here, show where it began and how it evolved. And the danger is that we think we are justified in doing all these things because we're the United States. As Madeleine Albright said, when she was Secretary of State under Clinton, she said, if we use force, it's because we're the United States of America. We're the indispensable nation. We stand taller and see farther than other countries. And we hear that same rhetoric from Hillary Clinton, and recently Barack Obama said the same thing again, that we're the indispensable nation. Well, it's not, that's the attitude that we're trying to challenge. That's the idea of American exceptionalism.
Maybe it was in what you just said, but what was the critical point in either your research or your career where you were deciding that this is a story that needs to be told, this information needs to be given out? When was that?
Well, for me, it was really in 1995 when I was starting my Nuclear Studies Institute. It was the 50th anniversary of the atomic bombing. There was a lot of hoopla and a lot of controversy. That was the time when the Enola Gay exhibit got canceled at the National Air and Space Museum at the Smithsonian because we weren't ready yet as a country to honestly grapple with that, and the exhibit was somewhat critical. I mean, it presented different perspectives. But for the 50th anniversary, one of my favorite students was from Japan, and her grandfather had died in Hiroshima, and her mother and grandmother survived. So we decided we were going to commemorate the 50th anniversary by teaching classes on this at American University and bringing students to Japan to commemorate the 50th anniversary. But in the midst of that planning, the Enola Gay exhibit got canceled at the Smithsonian, and the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki asked if we would do an exhibit at American University taking many of those artifacts that were supposed to be at the Smithsonian and showing them and doing an exhibit on the atomic bombing. And one of those artifacts was the most controversial. That's the lunchbox of an 11-year-old girl who disappeared completely in the bombing. But they found her lunchbox with the carbonized rice and carrots inside. And what we suggested at the Smithsonian was if they wanted to do a small exhibit, let's just show the plane, the Enola Gay, and that lunchbox. That could be it. We had that lunchbox at American University. It was the last time they allowed it out of Japan.
Yeah, you're never allowed to show the victims.
They didn't want to show any showing of the victims. It was one of the things they demanded. The Air Force Association demanded no photos of victims in the exhibit.
For me, it was 2000. I was 13 years later. It was 2007 we got this thing kicked off. I went back to the class 13 years later. I kept going back to the class and talking there. And I said, let's make that Wallace bomb movie. And it was supposed to be an hour, a documentary, hour and a half, I thought I'd do. And we ended up doing this monstrosity of 10 hours and an 800-page book to boot, which was born 2 years into the process. It took 5 years off and on. But the real ideological, emotional, I think the emotional reason I did it was that I was living the nightmare from 2000 to 2007 of Mr. Bush. And I was in college with him. I went to Yale when I started my life, and he was in the same class. I dropped out. And to see him guiding this country towards this madness, Dr. Strangelove kind of situation, really got under my skin. And I wanted to commit myself more completely, almost take the vows and cross the line and say, I'm going to become a documentarian. Not quite, but I'm going to do it. Just, I'm sick of being called out as a fabricator and all that nonsense. I'm going to go and I'm going to make a documentary. And this time I'm going to tell everything that I have learned or I'm learning from my life on. That's the idea behind it. And I think that's what's good about it, because we both came to it from different places, different times. But we did meet up. So 2 is better than 1. That's one thing I can draw a lesson from. And 3 is probably better than 1. Same thing is true about a protest movement. If you get some good people, something can grow from that. So you guys keep protesting the bombs and the drones and the new space warfare is a new huge factor, far bigger than the bomb. Is the ability to destroy the planet in one get-go, like in Star Wars. Those of you who have seen Chapter 10 may know what I'm talking about.
But Oliver didn't mention that he dropped out of Yale in order to volunteer for infantry in Vietnam. Right, and he served in Vietnam. He was wounded twice. He was decorated, and he saved a lot of people's lives. And it's a different history. I was an anti-war activist by the time during that period, and Oliver went over there and fought for this country, or he thought at the time.
I don't know how long we're going to be here. We'll see.
Hi, I have a follow-up question about the process of actually getting the movie made. So how do you sell a project like this that goes from an hour and a half to 10
You can't.
hours?
It's very hard. I mean, don't even start, okay? Don't go there. It was impromptu, and we had some private backing and from South America, and we also had 3 very smart producers, and we got some advances from foreign distributor and from Showtime. But it was supposed to be a 2-year deal and a 12-hour project. And by the time we really got down to the nitty-gritty in the trenches of rewriting, writing, finding this footage from all over the world, and we were cutting at a fast clip, as you can see. But we had to be very, very smart about this and creative. It took, I was making features. He was writing books and teaching. I was also doing documentaries. We did a lot of other things, but we stayed on this for 5 years. So don't go there. Start with an hour if you can. Try to make it a small budget. Try to keep it local. Documentaries are far cheaper to make than a feature film. Yeah.
Just wanted to ask a question about your motivation about getting the history right here. About this is a story that obviously a lot of Americans do not know, or we know a different version of it. So maybe tell me a little bit about what motivates you guys, either for the film or for the book, about telling this different view of history, just for the viewer aspect.
I'll just jump in and quickly say, because Peter does this professionally. I'm an amateur. But I love putting movie clips into this because it shows you how movies affected the time. And Patton, for example, had a tremendous influence on our policy. Nixon took heart from Patton because it was about America never loses. It's an amazingly, militaristic film, but it's powerful nonetheless. And it seems the militaristic films are often drive our country. When Bush, during that period after Reagan, that right-wing conservatism worked. The rise of the right we traced for 30 years from Reagan onward. And you see it in the films from the 1990s coming on. First of all, the discovery through Stephen Ambrose and Tom Brokaw and Steven Spielberg of the greatest generation, which is this, worship of World War II and America's role in winning the war. As Ambrose says, the D-Day is the climactic battle of World War II, whereas we show, I think, clearly that Stalingrad is, and D-Day is 2 years too late. But there are myths, such as America is, apple pie. We have to buy that we won World War II, and that begins the problem. But, in that greatest generation spirit, look what movies did, the role they played. Private Ryan, the movie with Pearl Harbor, amazing.
Black Hawk Down.
Well, let me get to that, Pearl Harbor, this guy, Jerry Bruckheimer, goes to the Pentagon, he gets all the equipment he needs, and he reverses the history book. I mean, it feels like we won Pearl Harbor at the end, or we're getting our fighting spirit back. We're going to come and then we have this movie, Black Hawk Down, which is a worship of technology, the slaughter of Somalis, and the glorification of every American who's killed is killed with music and great heroic sacrifice. And we love our military, and this resounds through the nation. Never in the 1960s or 70s did we hear this kind of talk about the military. It's almost, reminds me of Roman times or worse times or German times, where you have to worship the military. And wait till Super Bowl Sunday, and you'll see plenty of evidence of it if you're blind. And then don't forget a movie like Gladiator even, although it's in another form. It's about an ancient time, but it comes on 2000 at the cusp of this new age of terror. And again, it's about the might, militarism, the Roman Empire, much more worshipped than the Greek Empire, because the Greek Empire was one of the mind. The Roman Empire was one of the muscle, and the barbarian. Spartacus is popular on television. That history plays all the time, but it's a false history. It's created by movies. Say what you have to say about your history books.
Well, you were asking, I think, if I remember the question, it was a long answer. If I remember the question, it was the purpose, not the purpose of history, purpose of the project, right? Well, we work on the assumption that everybody has an understanding of history, and that, as Carl Becker said, every man is his own historian, but people's understanding of history is usually very skewed and distorted and partial. But what people understand about the past shapes the way they act in the present and the way they're going to act in the future, and it really limits what they can think. We find that understanding of the past, if people think that the way history turned out is the only way this country could have been, then they're not going to be able to dream, they're not going to be able to imagine, they're not going to be able to see a different future, they're not going to be able to, there's no utopianism left in America. And that's one of the best things about the 1960s was this idea that we could change the world. We really believed we could change the world, make a different and better world. So what we're trying to do here is show also the mistakes the United States has made, but also how close we've come repeatedly to having different outcomes. How close how much difference a Wallace would have made. 5 more feet might have changed the course of history. Kennedy not being assassinated in '63 might have changed the course of history. If Eisenhower had responded to the Soviet reaching out in 1953 when Stalin died, could have changed the course of history. At Reykjavik, if Reagan had accepted Gorbachev's initiatives there, we could have abolished nuclear weapons in 1986. 1989, at the end of the Cold War, when the Soviets don't intervene in those countries and they reach out to the United States, and Bush doesn't respond and instead invades Panama and invades Kuwait. I mean, all these opportunities in Obama's election in 2008, another great moment in which history could have gone in a different direction. So our purpose is to show the human possibilities, but to try to plant the understanding in people's minds that they can act, they can change things, that movements change things, leaders help change things, and that things don't have to be the way they are, and they can actually be a lot better.
I just would like to point out one quickly as a footnote, because it's important. In 1989, when Bush, the father, the 41st one, did what he did, it was very benign. He was going to, in response to the invasion in Kuwait. But the really important stuff that happened, it was beneath the radar. He put American troops on the mainland of Saudi Arabia, which is the Mecca. And from there came all these issues of fundamentalism and the rejection of the United States to go into the Holy Land, of their Holy Land. Saudi Arabia is tantamount to a classic invasion of their spiritual life, which is the worst thing you can do to people. And we did it. And we never got out. Bush used Kuwait and the war, and we go into it in detail, how much of that is staged and how much is public relations. But he left those troops there, and that became a core issue for Osama bin Laden and those like him, and remains one. But not only did we stay there, but we moved out all over the Gulf, Navy, Air Force, and foot soldiers, all over Africa now, starting all over Africa, North Africa, and we're into these areas of Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. We've been in and out. And we're threatening. These are all the old territories of the old Soviet Union we fought. So we're encircling them. We have NATO bases all across Eastern Europe. Everything that Stalin had a nightmare about has happened to Russia.
And now we're doing it to China.
And now we're moving towards this Asia pivot because of Hillary Clinton and Obama's stated policy. The Asia pivot is doing the same thing, containing China. So what are we doing with the forces that we have? All these years, we never voted on it. We are simply we're just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And now space, and here we are. We all sit in this room, and we're all colonized by this empire. Every one of us. And whether we have more money or not than the average third world person, that's not the issue. We're still under the subjection of an empire. And think what we might, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, First Amendment, what are the lines? We don't even know what the lines of what we can do to oppose it. If we assemble to talk about an Occupy protest movement, who knows who's in that meeting, who's going to be taping us. It gets really suspicious behavior. I walked through the airport yesterday in Bloomington, Illinois, and I'm hearing any suspicious behavior loop, any suspicious behavior. Don't you think that affects the minds of the citizenry? It makes us so aware that we're in an Orwellian state.
Hi. So my question is, not to be super defeatist, but if we have had, if America has sort of been this world police in a sense, right, and we took over the reins from the British Empire, how do we practically even begin to solve that problem? Because I feel like, in a way, at this point, a lot of the world has become really dependent on the U.S. for aid, right? I was listening to a news story about Syria and what's happening there. And a lot of Syrian leaders and people, the rebels, they are almost counting on America to intervene and to help them out, whether it be monetarily or, with actual troops or weapons. So how do we, where do we start in terms of, not being the people who sort of decide what everything, or sort of being the center in the sense, and isn't it, would you say that there's a risk that the only thing that will happen is someone else will take over from us, and it'll probably be like a China or India?
Don't forget the British imperialist mentality on that.
Well, first of all, the United States can't afford to play that role anymore. The United States is cutting back on its defense spending. We've now got somewhere between 700 and 1,000 bases around the world. How many bases does China have? Our big foe. Does anybody know how many bases China has? 0. Actually, they have one small one now. So, but we don't even know how many. We know that we've got 6,000 military installations, bases in the United States, but between 700 and 1,000 abroad. We've got these carrier strike groups. We've got at least 11 potentially carrier strike groups, which are more powerful than the bases. Our footprint is everywhere at this point. Our defense spending, our military spending is everywhere. So first of all, we can't play that role anymore. What we need is a United Nations, a real United Nations, in which the citizens of the world can make some decisions collectively about how we handle these kinds of crises. Because they're real. The situation in Syria is terrible. What the Islamic extremists are doing in Mali is terrible. We understand that. But the United States can't play that role anymore. What happens with empires, Paul Kennedy wrote a great book about the rise and fall of the great powers, talking about all the empires. They all get overextended. They get overly ambitious, grandiose in their thinking that they can control the world in this way, and they all collapse as a result. We're in a dangerous situation because the United States has lost its moral authority in the world in the last decade, certainly. The United States is no longer looked at as the good guys in the world, much of the world. But the United States is declining economically in relative terms, but militarily we're still invincible. So what's going to happen if you've got an empire that's got the strength to destroy the world and without the moral or the economic wherewithal to play that role as well? So that, to me, creates some dangerous possibilities. And China would estimate now that by 2030, China's economy is going to surpass the United States economy. They're already the second biggest economy in the world. So we need to find international institutions that can, the African nations should be intervening in Mali, and not just the French, and certainly not the United States. So we need to be thinking about different ways to solve some of these problems. And you want to say about the British Empire?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and I've been asked in many different forms. It's often a neoconservative position, which is, in Britain recently, the commentator got right to the point. He said, well, you people have been running the world. What's wrong with that? Very practical, and I understand. He's a British Empire guy. He worked, he thinks, for the 200 years that the British dominated the place, although if you talk to the people of India or the people of Iran or the people from the many countries in China that hate their guts, to this day, you would get a completely different interpretation of the British Empire. It was to the benefit of Britain and much to the detriment of many of those colonies, although some of them learned how to speak proper English and blah, 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 and knew how to train and were very, very English-oriented. But it's not just an English-oriented world, and it shouldn't be, as Henry Wallace said, by the way. But the idea is, in your question, and every neoconservative assumes that because there has been nothing worse that has happened, that therefore this is good. And what you're doing is ignoring all the millions of people who died in the Guatemalas, the Chiles, the Argentinas, the Vietnams, the Timors, the Indonesias, the Congos of the world because of our intervening, mixing, screwing up things. So many more people have died in that than any Hungarian invasion repressed by the Soviets that no one even keeps track. And it's a weird disbalance. So I said to the British guy, it was on the radio, I said, the problem is that Britain has used America as a stalking horse since World War II. Because we're the guys doing what you guys don't want to do anymore. And you're saying that, what's wrong with a global police force? You don't look at the other side of it. What is it that we do right? Hillary Clinton said at the Foreign Relations Club, this self-congratulatory comment, America is the greatest nation in the world. Since World War II, there has been no Third World War. Oh, thank you, madam. Thank you very much for not giving us World War III. How do you assume how do you assume the world could have been worse in Vietnam for those people, or worse in the Congo? The world is a horrible place for many people.
One of the legacies of the American empire is that the richest 300 people in the world have more wealth than the poorest 3 billion. Just think of it. What kind of planet do we have where 300 people have more wealth than 3 billion people? So this is our empire. What is the Pax Americana brought to the planet? I mean, it could have been worse. Yeah, it could be. If the Germans had won World War II, we would have been, it would have been a lot worse. Half my relatives were killed in the Holocaust. I know it. What more evil? The United States is not evil in that way, but we think of ourselves as good and benevolent, and that's dangerous in a different way because we don't question what we've done and we don't see the damage that we've done And we're not saying that another empire would be better. We're not saying we want to see the Chinese empire. That's certainly not something we want to see either. We want to see the human species as collectively think about our planet. This is all of our planet. And look what we're doing to this planet. Look what kind of future are we leaving to our children and grandchildren with the kind of global warming and pollution and you know, what's going on now. You see the weather patterns here. I've been told this is a warm day for Chicago. But, you know, we're seeing this kind of, the extreme weather that's happening everywhere is another symptom of what we're doing to the planet.
Hi. I have a question. It's related, I think, to this notion of optimism, but it more has to do with the way in which you decided upon portraying Wallace as you did. Because as you had mentioned Obama earlier, you know, I was thinking that earlier, if he was not elected in 2008, you know, there'd be a very different story, perhaps, of what could have been, right, in that administration for the first 4 years, because you wouldn't have known. So with Wallace, it's something similar, right? There was maybe a promise of hope or optimism, but it's the unknown. And I'm just wondering kind of why you decided to present it in such a clear question of optimism rather than thinking or talking about perhaps more of the forces he might have encountered, you know, against what his plan was in your speculations and opinion portion of the film.
Yeah, that's a good question, because we don't know what would have happened had Wallace gotten in there. Would he have been able to do the things we know what he wanted to do? He was very, very clear and articulate about what he wanted to do. But would the forces have lined up against him? Would the military have acted? Would he have been assassinated? John Kennedy is a good example. John Kennedy, after the movie, after the book 7 Days in May came out in 1962, which is about a military coup against a liberal president who wants to end the Cold War, John Kennedy said, you know, it could happen. He said, if there was a first bay of pigs, they'll think the president was young and in over his head. If there was a second bay of pigs, they'll start to wonder seriously about his ability to run the country. He said, if there was a third bay of pigs, they would move. They'd move to overthrow the president. And we argue that, and Kennedy, they were the equivalent of 7 or 8 bays of pigs under Kennedy. That people, the military-industrial complex, writ large, hated him. And the CIA hated him. The Joint Chiefs of Staff hated him. And the hatred not only got worse after the Cuban Missile Crisis, but then when Kennedy made his commencement address at American University in June of '63, he called for an end to the Cold War. I mean, the people really... So what happens to if Wallace becomes president in '45? There's no way to know, but the possibility existed that he could have changed the world, and that's very important. But we do know that he could have definitely single-handedly stopped the atomic bombing. That far we can go. We can't say that he could have ended the Cold War, because that would have taken cooperation by the Soviets as well as by other forces in the United States.
So, gentlemen, first I'd like to applaud you both for asking the tough questions with regards to the atomic bomb. It's very good of you. So my question is more towards the atomic bomb. One, what would what's your stance on whether or not we actually should have had the bomb in the first place from back in the 1940s? And then secondly, with today's foreign policy and nuclear deterrence, where would the nation be today if we did not have nuclear deterrence? And which country, I guess, would take over and then, you know, I mean, because there's no way we'd be the first country as far as economically and everything as well.
The question about the bomb is an important one. The United States developed the bomb as a deterrent from the beginning. The people who pushed for the bomb to be developed were the emigre scientists who had escaped from Nazi-occupied Europe. And after they got word in January of 1939 that the Germans had split the uranium atom, they immediately recognized this represented the theoretical possibility of creating atomic bombs. And so they pushed the U.S. government, but the U.S. government, the military and the government were not interested. And so they, in July 16, 1939, Leo Szilard and Eugene Wigner got a car and drove out to see Albert Einstein. And Einstein signed the letter to President Roosevelt urging to begin the bomb project. So the reason we started the project was because we were afraid what would happen if Hitler got atomic bombs. we figured out early on, well, not early on, in late 1944, we figured out that Germany was not developing atomic bombs, atomic weapons, that they'd abandoned their nuclear program. At that point, only one scientist left the Manhattan Project. That was Joseph Rotblat. Great, great man. He said that our whole purpose was to use this as a deterrent against Germany. We should stop the project now. And Rotblat later got the Nobel Peace Prize and deserved it for a lifetime effort to stop this. So in that sense, we started it out of good reason. Einstein says, I made one great mistake in my life, signing the letter to President Roosevelt urging him to start the bomb project. He said, but there were reasons why I did that. He actually wrote 3 letters to Roosevelt to do that. So starting it was one thing, but we could have stopped it because it was supposed to be used against the Germans. But Leslie Groves, as you saw, says right from the very beginning, I knew that Russia was our enemy, not Germany, and not Japan. So it becomes complicated. In terms of nuclear deterrence since then, deterrence works up to the point it no longer works. Then there's no longer a world around to tell them that they were wrong, that they screwed up, right? And that's what almost happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis. We became, if you see our episode on the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's terrifying how close we actually came. In fact, we were dropping depth charges on a Soviet submarine and we didn't realize we had knocked out the power. The carbon dioxide was rising. It was 120 degrees in there. People were fainting, and the captain, Savitsky, gives the order at that point to launch the nuclear torpedo. And they were about to start World War III. They were about to start the nuclear war. They had nuclear torpedoes, which we didn't know when we were hitting them with those depth charges. But Arkhipov, another commander on there, talked him out of it. Had he not talked him out of it, they were ready to launch. They had armed the nuclear torpedo, about to launch it. That would have started, then the United States would have retaliated with nuclear weapons, and much of the world, as we know it, would no longer exist if there wasn't nuclear winter, and all of us would have been gone. So, but that's the danger. Over and over again, these close calls with nuclear weapons, whether accidental or deliberate. We almost had a nuclear war between India and Pakistan just a few years ago. I mean, then they're heating it up again there. Japan and China now are, threatening each other and saber rattling. It's a dangerous world. And it's a world in which I don't want any single person, whether it's Obama or it's the forces in China or Pakistan, to have veto power over the future existence of the human species. And that's what they do right now. And that's why we've got to get rid of nuclear weapons.
Answering his question practically, what do you do now? Go back to the Lilienthal plan?
Well, we have a lot. How do we do that? We know how to get rid of nuclear weapons if we have the will to do so. Obama made a great speech in Prague in May of 2009, and he called for nuclear abolition. And he said, we have a responsibility to lead that process because we're the only country that's dropped nuclear bombs on another country in wartime. That's America's responsibility. And now, does everybody want to do that? The Russians are hesitant. You know why the Russians are hesitant? Because the United States is so far ahead of them in conventional weapons. So actually, we're going to have to not only get rid of nuclear weapons, we're going to have to cut back on conventional weapons in order to have countries have the confidence in doing so. And we're going to have intrusive inspections, very intrusive inspections, which is part of the Atchison-Lilienthal plan in the beginning. I think it can be done and should happen gradually. We should first get down to the point where we're below the threshold for nuclear winter. The idea of nuclear winter is that if a certain number of bombs are detonated, we can create this cloud over the planet, the sun won't get through, and we could kill off the vegetation as well as life on the planet. We don't know what the threshold is, but the experts have been lowering the number of bombs that would have to be dropped in order to trigger that point. But again, like with climate change, it's not a risk that we can take or should take or have the right to take that future generations should be born because of our arrogance, our hubris. I mean, the sense that we have the right to determine the future of humanity.
May I just add on something before you ask? As a dramatist, I sympathize with your point of view. You're in the military. These are not practical answers. This is a hopeful answer. That there's not going to lead, there's no way the Roman Empire would give down, would just say, well, we're going to allow regional powers to emerge like Venezuela, Iran, Russia, China. We're against regional powers that are not on our side completely. We must have anyone who opposes our ideology. It's not going to happen. So it's a very tough place. But it never, as a dramatist, I'm answering, not as a historian, because this is all speculation. In my experience of life, nothing works out the way you thought it was going to work out. No one, when I grew up, thought that the Soviet Union would dissolve so peacefully in 1989. So things that you do not see are more likely the outcome. There is, as a dramatist, a very strong possibility the military will screw up, because the military is prone to diverse influences. As you know, there are so many strong right-wing, there's so many religious forces in the military, there's all kinds of people, there's the Petraeuses of the world, and if you want to push to the extremes, there are the McChrystals of the world. So people, there is still the possibility of a military coup if things got too chaotic in a congressional gridlock where politics are frustrating and all the frustrations build up in the populace and all chaos sets in. That's possible. So I would certainly not overlook that. That happened in the Roman Empire. More and more bribes were paid to the legions, to the Praetorian Guard. There was coups. As presidents came, went. Assassinations occurred regularly. The empire didn't end in a bang. It ended in a slow whimper through Christianity and various forces of barbarism. So I don't think you can't have this debate with John McCain on a fucking Senate hearing committee because it's impossible. You can't put this thing in black and white. It's more nuanced.
But except that, I agree, of course, but we look practically. We used to have 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world, right? We're down to about 20,000 now. Okay, that's progress. That's important. We have treaties. We didn't have nuclear treaties till '63. We've got arms control treaties now. At Reykjavik, we came within one word or two words of abolishing nuclear weapons. If you study what happened in 1986 at Reykjavik with Reagan, of all people, and Gorbachev, if Reagan had agreed to limit Star Wars testing to the laboratory for 10 years, then they had a deal to eliminate nuclear weapons. Secretary of State George Shultz said to Reagan, said, well, should I do this? And Shultz says, yes, do it. Paul Nitze, who's a hawk, says to Reagan, do it, take the deal. It's the best deal we're going to get. Let's get rid of nuclear weapons. And then he turns to Richard Pearl, who we saw from the Bush years, the Prince of Darkness, and Richard Pearl says, no, don't do it, don't do it. And Richard Pearl talks him out of it. But so I don't think it's entirely impossible and idealistic. I think it's realistic to think that we can abolish nuclear weapons at some point, and we have to maybe we'll do it gradually. Let's keep getting that number down gradually. I wish Obama was more aggressive.
But, Peter is overlooking conveniently one fact is that we do have space and cyber now, and we have weapons that we don't even know are in the laboratory that could probably do far more damage, even perhaps than these bombs. So they may become as obsolete as what Obama's bayonets and naval battleships, right? So you understand it's complicated, but it's very complicated.
Oliver's point, we're developing full spectrum dominance, which is land, sea, air, cyberspace, and outer space. Our schemes, our military schemes, are advancing, and we can trace people.
If you want to read up on that, Alfred McCoy has written some great stuff. Alfred McCoy from University of Wisconsin. New books on it. Please look it up.
Now one of the things he talks about is that we can trace people and track them and kill them through biometrics just by tracking their irises. Our ability to kill has gotten very sophisticated. And
you were going to say something. Well, that's George Orwell time. That's the euphemisms.
But Obama refers to them as kill lists. They talk to him as kill lists.
Yes, sir. He's been waiting. Sorry.
My name is Ziad Dadaboy, and your books and documentaries talk about the untold history. So I was wondering what your view is on the current movie Zero Dark 30 and how many critics blast it for glorifying torture when in reality torture didn't help towards the hunt for OBL, and how the movie doesn't portray it accurately at all. I was wondering what your view is on that.
Well, you know Catherine Bigelow.
Well, we presented our position in Chapter 10, we mentioned, we didn't go specifically because torture we know it's that. There's other issues on torture. We saw plenty of it at Abu Ghraib, and we know that it's mental torture can kill you as much as Guantanamo. 9 suicides. We have more suicides in Guantanamo than convictions, by the way. 9 suicides, 6 convictions, I believe, is a number. Pretty outrageous. But these are men without hope. In other words, they die from without hope. It's the word. It's like the Count of Monte Cristo. You just wither away. It's the hardest thing in the world is indefinite detention. But the forms of abuse in that movie and so many other movies in our system are taken for granted by the public. 24 was the most successful television series for years. I couldn't watch it, but I couldn't believe the vomit that they were putting out on the American people, the fear, the terror. And people sit in front of the TV, it's free, they watch it, they take it in, and they believe it. They believe this terror exists. It becomes the other, the communism, the drug war, the Noriega. It's everything evil, the other, I call it. And it becomes and it's on television, it's all around us, and it's in our culture. That's what the film represents, and on a deeper level than all, and our media does not even bring it up because they're so debased and corrupted, is the vigilante justice at the end. There's a wonderful movie from 1962, you must see it. It's called Judgment at Nuremberg, old-fashioned, corny. Stanley Kramer made a beautiful movie with Judge Spencer Tracy was the judge, and the German people were on trial, basically. It was a lower-level hearing, it's not the top. And it talked about how civilian society had been corrupted all these war years, and how the evil was allowed to creep and creep and creep until it invaded the justice system. It's a beautiful movie. And when we shoot a man and he's wounded and he's clearly incapable, and we have trained professional soldiers who can actually literally bring him back for justice, think about the consequences of a trial. How, no matter all the ridiculous publicity, imagine the consequences of taking bin Laden, putting him on trial to the world openly and saying, you, sir, and letting him defend himself and make all the accusations he wants. Let the world judge. God, it would have been like bringing Hitler to trial at Nuremberg. We didn't quite, but we brought others, top dogs. And we saw they were little men. We saw the banality of their opinions. We saw the evil. And it made the world a better place. It gave us a higher civilization, a moral code that we believed in.
Okay, I'm sorry to say we have time for one.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I am Professor Maureen Flanagan. I am the chair of the Humanities Department here at IIT. And we're very pleased that we're able to have this program to welcome Professor Kuznick and the director Oliver Stone, who will be here in a little while. But before we get started, we're going to do a few introductions, and I would like to introduce Dean Russell Betts, who is the Dean of the College of Science and Letters.
Thank you, Maureen. We're fortunate today to have Oliver Stone. At least he'll be here later. I gather he's suffering from the flu and is resting in the hotel for a while. And Professor Peter Kuznick. And to show and discuss a series of documentaries they've put on cable television entitled The Untold History of the United States. Of course, Oliver Stone is an iconic filmmaker, and I'm sure everybody in this room has seen one or more of his films, famous ones, JFK, Platoon, Scarface, and the list goes on. He's a longtime collaborator with Professor Kuznick, who is a professor at American University and is director of the Nuclear Studies Institute, which focuses on the history of nuclear weapons and the Cold War and so on. Just looking on the web, I saw he was quite involved when the Enola Gay was put up on exhibition in the Smithsonian out by Dulles Airport. Last summer, I had the pleasure of going to that museum and seeing the Enola Gay with John Anderson was there too. It was an alumni event, a great occasion, and to be able to see that piece of history is just amazing to look up and see the glass window on the front of the plane that the bomb aimer must have looked down through as the bomb was released on Hiroshima. Of course, Professor Kuznick had pointed out that this display contained none of the other aspects of nuclear weapons and the terrible things that came with them. You probably heard me say many times how important I think it is, particularly at a place like IIT, that our scientists and technologists also study the humanities and social sciences and learn how the world really works. And actually, when you think about it, the story of the development and use of nuclear weapons is an incredible mixture of science and technology and history and politics and ethics and cultural differences and prejudices. And I think we're going to see some of that today. Something we also forget often is that science is really not a whole lot different than anything else human beings do. It's done by humans, and with their normal good points and sometimes bad points. And anybody who's read or studied the history of the Manhattan Project sees the conflicts between the characters in that drama, Oppenheimer and Teller and Groves, and how that eventually led to the political downfall of Oppenheimer, caused in large part by Teller himself. The one thing that makes science a little bit different is we claim to be able to find the truth by requiring that what we do is repeatable. I do an experiment, I get a result. I write down what I do, you go and do it, and you get the same result. So we think we've arrived at some truth. In history, one doesn't have that luxury. You can't run history again, although the famous quote is, "Those who do not learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat them." But what happens in history is one can arrive at truth with a critical examination by many people from many different points of view of the same set of facts. And in that way, one might imagine there's some consistent and honest picture of what really happened. And I think this is part of what this series attempts to do. I should add, by the way, that this inability to repeat things is also true in some important areas of science. Cosmology, we have one
in 1942, so that to take the pressure off the Russians. Well, as you all know, that second front doesn't open until June of 1944. So there are a lot of things that go on that create the mistrust between the United States and the Soviet Union, even during the war. And that's what we deal with in the first two episodes. But we also introduce one very important character or actor who you're going to see in this episode without the background. So let me give you a little bit on that. Let me ask you, who was Roosevelt's vice president from 1941 to 1945? Yeah, but you know that, but most people don't know. I mean, Ari and Loretta were not supposed to be the ones to answer. Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace is a figure who's been largely lost to history, although he's what we consider him an absolutely remarkable human being. People who have extremely conservative views tend to look at him as a bad guy in history. But for Oliver and I, Henry Wallace was a visionary. He was Secretary of Agriculture during the first two New Deal administrations. And then Roosevelt insisted on having it on the ticket in 1940 because he knew we were on the verge of fighting a war against fascism, and he wanted a real progressive anti-fascist on the ticket as vice president. So Wallace, finally they get him on the ticket, and he's extraordinary as vice president. In 1941, Henry Luce, the head of the Time Life empire, says that the 20th century must be the American century. The United States should dominate the world politically, economically, militarily, culturally. Henry Wallace countered that as vice president, and he said the 20th century must be the century of the common man. And he called for a worldwide people's revolution to end imperialism and colonialism and economic exploitation and monopolies and cartels, for global full employment, for spreading the fruits of science and technology throughout the third world. He was proposing he said that what we need is a worldwide people's revolution in the tradition of the American Revolution, French Revolution, Latin American revolutions, and the Russian Revolution. He said that America's fascists are those people who think Wall Street comes first and the country comes second. He was very, very progressive, very radical in his views. And there were a lot of people who hated him. The British and the French hated him. Thanks, Maureen, Russell. Thank you all for coming out on this cold day. What I want to do is give you a little bit of background, because what you're going to be seeing is episode 3 of the Untold History of the United States that was just shown on Showtime. It's a 10-part documentary film series that goes along with our book. But if you just tune into episode 3 without knowing what's in 1 and 2, you're going to miss a little bit. So I want to fill you in about what we said in 1 and 2. The book starts really in the late 19th century, and it's tracing the roots of American empire and the national security state. The documentaries begin with World War II, although we've added 2 more to the box set that we're going to be putting out that go back to the 1890s. But on television, we began with World War II. And the first myth that we were debunking in our chapter on World War II is the idea that the United States was responsible for the victory in Europe during World War II. What most Americans don't realize was that while the United States and the British were confronting 10 German divisions combined, the Russians were confronting 200. And that's the case until June of 1944. Most Americans don't realize that we lost about 305,000 people in combat. The Soviets lost 27 million people in total during World War II. So a lot of things that get lost in the kind of American exceptionalist telling of the history that we think is important to understand, because we go from there in chapter 2 to talking about the roots of the Cold War and how that develops as part of World War II. And among the things we point out there is while the Germans were attacking Russia and the Russians were asking for help, Roosevelt in June of 1942 asked Stalin to send Molotov to the United States to meet with Roosevelt. And Roosevelt and Molotov and General Marshall issued a statement in June of 1942 saying that the United States was pledged to open up a second front in Europe before the end of universe.
But also things like climate change, global warming. That's a one-shot deal. And so maybe we have something to learn from the historians. I'll just welcome you all here and pass it back to Maureen, who's going to explain how the day will go. And thank you.
What we're going to do is I will be introducing Professor Kuznick. He's going to say a few words of introduction about what you're going to see, and then after the documentary piece is finished, we will open the floor to discussion, questions, by which time Oliver Stone will be here also. So he'll be here to talk to you about what he's done and what it is that he thinks is important in the sense of why he's made this documentary, why he and Professor Kuznick have made this documentary. Because I'm a U.S. historian, I'm doubly pleased that we could bring this to IIT. And just to follow up a tiny bit on what Dean Betts has said, history is messy. And history is messy because it's made by people, and people are messy. And so something such as an episode dedicated to thinking about the development and use of the atomic bomb in World War II is likely to be, quite often is, very controversial. People have different opinions. People feel strongly about these things. And as a historian, I think that's good. I think that we should debate these things, that we should not have one set view of how things are, that we should not strive for consensus. We should strive for discussion, for dialogue, in an attempt to sort out the various things that we know, that we don't know, that other people know, that can contribute to the conversation. So, without going any further, I would like to introduce Professor Peter Kuznick, who is as Russell said, the director of the Nuclear Studies program at American University, and he is a professor of U.S. history. Peter?